Hey, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies, and we'd like to do a lecture on Gnostic psychology. We're doing the Introduction to Gnostic Psychology series. We are on the 8th class, Knowledge, Being, Understanding, and Comprehension. But before we jump into today's material, let's do a quick review of the previous class. For the past two classes, 6 and 7, we've been studying this idea of what is the personality. And then specifically in part 7, we talked about the need to make the personality passive and the essence active. We said that the personality is what is imaginary in us, what is not real. But the essence is that spark of divinity. It's what is real in us. The personality goes away after a lifetime. It belongs to the culture and the time period. It's related often with the physical body as well. The essence persists throughout multiple lifetimes, multiple existences. And so once we get to the place where we've developed the personality, now we can contrast it with the essence in order to figure out what our essence is. And so in part 7, we talked about what the personality is. We said that personality consists of roles and buffers, resulting from a certain work of the centers. We described roles as scrolls of memories, scrolls of a material that allow you to receive impressions. We receive impressions through our senses. And then those impressions leave an imprint on those scrolls, which we then roll up within ourselves in our internal archive, which we call our memory. So our memories are really just impressions that we've received. So we can go back and transform those impressions, work on those impressions, meditate on them, and transform them, meaning change how they sit, how they feel, how they act inside of us, the way we interact with them, the way the personality uses them or doesn't use them. So that's work that we'll talk about in the intermediate and advanced classes. But just to give you a little preview about that and to understand that we want to differentiate between the personality and memories. But personality is made up of those memories, which are called roles, because they're roles or scrolls of impressions. And personality is made up of what Gnosis calls buffers, resulting from a certain work of the centers. The centers referred to there are the human machine. Intellect, emotional, movement, instinct, and sex. We said that buffers are mechanical, let's see if we can find it, artificial appliances that have been formed in us, generally unconsciously, in order to lessen shocks. Buffers soften shocks and soften the results of shocks so that we don't feel them. But we need shocks. We need to feel that something is wrong and we need to fix ourselves, or else we just feel like everything is okay and we just keep going in the same direction. So that shock of realizing that we're asleep, psychologically speaking, is extremely important for us to persist in waking up. But if we can justify to ourselves, oh, no, not a big deal, it's normal, then we don't push ourselves. And we don't persist in waking up, in awakening our consciousness. So buffers allow us to have contradictions. They allow us to not feel our own inner contradictions. Maybe we can see them in our friends or family. Maybe we can see them in our coworkers or our teachers or schoolmates or whomever it may be. But we all have them. And so we have to look at them with our self-observation. We have to discover them so that we can figure out which one it is. Is it yin or is it yang? Is it yes or is it no? Which one is it in us? We have to decide. Or we may decide that it's something dynamic that we need to decide in the moment. But often we have preconceived notions about what we should do instead of deciding in the moment. So buffers allow us to not feel our own contradictions. They're created slowly and gradually. Many are created artificially through education. Others are created under the hypnotic influence of our surroundings. But wherever they come from, and no matter how much easier life is with them, they keep us from the possibility of inner development. Because we can't feel those shocks that we mentioned before. And shocks are the only thing that can awaken us. Buffers are appliances, psychological appliances within us, by means of which a person can always be in the right. Meaning we can always be right and therefore we don't have to question our behavior. Well, I'm right and they're wrong. Of course, this is very problematic because it doesn't allow us to even look at it from their perspective. So how do we have compassion? How do we understand anything if we don't look at it from another person's perspective besides our own? If we always look from our own perspective, then we're not going to gain any wisdom, any understanding of the situation. That's what we're going to talk about today. Is how to gain understanding, or what we call comprehension. But to finish with what we've been talking about in the previous class, we need to work on buffers. We need to confront buffers and destroy them. That is, confront our own inner contradictions. And it means agreeing to, realizing the mistakes that we've made associated with those buffers, and changing who and what we are. But we have to, if we want to know ourselves, if we want to develop in this esoteric work, then we have to realize that we've got buffers and destroy them within ourselves. It's part of the esoteric work. All right, well, let's jump into today's class. Knowledge, being, understanding, and comprehension. There are two ways in which a human being's development proceeds: knowledge and being. In correct development, both knowledge and being develop simultaneously, parallel to and helping one another. But if knowledge gets too far ahead of being, or if being gets ahead of knowledge, then a person's development goes wrong, and sooner or later it must come to a standstill. So we want to understand how to develop ourselves. In order to do that, we have to develop both knowledge and being. Our culture nowadays, we could say almost universally on this planet, considers knowledge more important than being. So we'll look at this topic a little bit more. People understand what knowledge means, and they understand the possibility of different levels of knowledge. They understand that knowledge may be lesser or greater, that is to say, of one quality or of another quality. But they do not understand this in relation to being. Being for them simply means existence, which they see as being opposed to non-existence. They do not understand that being, or existence, may be of very different levels and categories. Take, for instance, the being of a mineral and of a plant. They are different being. The being of a plant and of an animal is again a different being. And the being of an animal and of a man is a different being as well. And it is said that the being of two people can differ from one another more than the being of a mineral and of an animal. This is exactly what people do not understand. And they do not understand that knowledge depends on being. And especially in Western culture, it is considered that a person may possess great knowledge. For example, they may be an able scientist who makes discoveries, advances science, and at the same time that they may be, and that they have the right to be, a petty, egotistical, mean, envious, vain, naive, and absent-minded person, which is their being. It seems to be considered normal that a professor must always forget his umbrella. And this is the professor's being. And people think that their knowledge does not depend on their being. People in Western culture put great value on the level of a person's knowledge, but they do not value the level of a person's being, and are not ashamed of the low level of their own being. They do not even understand what this means, and they do not understand that a person's knowledge depends on their level of being. If knowledge gets far ahead of being, then it becomes theoretical, abstract, and inapplicable to life, or actually harmful. Because instead of serving life and helping people to better struggle with the difficulties they meet, it begins to complicate their life. It brings new difficulties into it, new troubles and calamities which were not there before. For example, let's say we're studying Gnosis and Gnosis says, we should meditate on a daily basis before we go to bed or whatever. So we decide we're going to meditate before we go to bed. But we don't understand why we need to meditate before we go to bed. We just heard, we received the knowledge that Gnosis says X, Y, and Z, and so we're going to start to do that. So maybe that gets in the way of some other commitments that we had. And then the people that we had the commitments with, maybe they start to change their relationship with us because of that. And then that causes us problems because we don't understand. And so on and so forth. So let's understand this deeper. The reason that this could bring more calamities is that knowledge which is not in accordance with being cannot be large enough or sufficiently suited to a person's real needs. It will always be a knowledge of one thing together with the ignorance of another thing, a knowledge of the detail without a knowledge of the whole, a knowledge of the form without a knowledge of the essence. Since preponderance of knowledge over being is observed such preponderance of knowledge over being is observed in present culture. In present-day culture, the idea of the value and importance of the level of being is completely forgotten. And it is forgotten that the level of knowledge is determined by the level of being. Actually, at a given level of being, the possibilities of knowledge are limited and finite. A change in the nature of knowledge is possible only with a change in the nature of being. Knowledge and being are very relative. Different degrees of knowledge exist. For example, there are people who may know a lot about medicine, more than someone else. There are dentists who are more learned than others. There are mechanics who know more than others with regards to automobiles. But that is very relative. As for being, it is also very relative. Some have developed their being more than others. There is no doubt, for example, that the being of a saint is more developed than that of a perverse individual. So there are different levels of being, and it is also relative. And yet knowledge and being are different. For someone who has knowledge of geography, we could say that what they know is true or false, that their knowledge is correct, or that it is mistaken. However, regarding matters of being, the notions of true or false, mistaken or correct cannot be used, because they do not fit. Instead, we use good or bad. We say, so-and-so is a good woman, or what's his name is a bad guy. And if he's a very bright person, but he's still a bad guy, we might say of him, he's a bad person. If he's a good guy, then we might say of him that he's a good person, regardless of his level of knowledge. So then these things, knowledge and being, are different. And the terms used to designate being, or to designate knowledge, are also different. Taken in itself, a person's being has many sides. The most characteristic feature of a modern person's being is the absence of unity in them. And further, the absence in them of even traces of those properties which they most like to ascribe to themselves, that is, lucid consciousness, free will, a permanent I or ego, and the ability to do. It may surprise you to hear that the chief feature of a modern person's being, which explains everything else that is lacking in them, is sleep. We're talking about psychological sleep. A modern man lives in sleep. He is born in sleep and he dies in sleep. What knowledge can a sleeping person have? And if you think about it, and at the same time remember that sleep is the chief feature of our being, it will at once become clear to you that if a person really wants knowledge, then he or she must first of all think about how to awaken, that is, about how to change their level of being. So, to clarify, knowledge and being grow together, ideally. But if our knowledge gets too far ahead of our being, then what we have is just theoretical knowledge. For example, I could read an article about riding a skateboard, but until I ride the skateboard, I don't have any experience with it. I don't have any being related with it. So I could read a bunch of information about it, and that doesn't mean that I know how to do it. I might have read some information and theoretically understand how to do it, but I haven't done it yet. So being is doing it. So if we want to develop our knowledge, we have to change our level of being. Because as our level of being develops, then the knowledge that I read about immediately can become applicable. But our being, our level of being, catches up to our knowledge if our knowledge is too far ahead. So it's important, if we want to develop properly, that we develop our being so that our knowledge is always applicable, so that it's together, so that we're learning by doing. Exteriorly, a person's being has many different sides: activity or passivity, truthfulness or a tendency to lie, sincerity or insincerity, courage, cowardice, self-control or lack of self-control, irritability, egoism, readiness for self-sacrifice, pride, vanity, conceit, hard-working, lazy, moral. All these and many more make up the level of being of a person. But all this is entirely mechanical in people. Generally speaking, the level of being of a modern person is of very inferior quality. If you think of this, you will understand why only few can receive real knowledge. Their level of being prevents it. Generally speaking, the balance between knowledge and being is even more important than a separate development of one or the other. Although it is precisely one-sided development that often seems particularly attractive to people. If knowledge outweighs being, then a person knows but has no power to do. It is useless knowledge. On the other hand, if being outweighs knowledge, then a person has the power to do, but does not know what to do. The level of being they have acquired becomes aimless, and efforts made to attain it prove to be fruitless. The development of knowledge without changing one's level of being gives what's called a scoundrel. Let me read that to you again. The development of knowledge without changing one's level of being produces a scoundrel, that is, an unprincipled person. They don't have the experience to understand why we need principles. It's also sometimes called a weak yogi. That is to say, a person who knows a great deal but can do nothing. A person who does not understand what they know. A person without appreciation. A person for whom there is no difference between one kind of knowledge and another. And the development of being without knowledge, so the opposite, gives what is sometimes called a stupid saint. That is, a person who can do a great deal. Maybe they can heal people even. But they don't know what to do, or why, nor with what object or aim. And if this stupid saint does anything, then they act in obedience to their subjective feelings, which could greatly lead them astray and cause them to commit grave mistakes, that is, to actually do the opposite of what they want. In either case, both the scoundrel or weak yogi and the stupid saint are eventually brought to a standstill. Neither can develop any further. In order to understand this, and in general the nature of knowledge and the nature of being, as well as their interrelation, it is necessary to understand the relation of knowledge and being to understanding, or what is called comprehension in Gnosis. People often confuse knowledge with understanding and do not clearly grasp what is the difference between them. Knowledge by itself does not give understanding, nor is understanding increased by an increase of knowledge alone. Understanding depends on the relation of knowledge to being. It is the result of both knowledge and being. And knowledge and being must not diverge too far, otherwise one will lack understanding. So, if we go back to the example with the skateboard, if I've been reading articles about riding a skateboard, but I don't possess a skateboard, or I've never ridden a skateboard before, then all I have is knowledge. But when I get on the skateboard and start riding it, or try to ride it, then I can start to apply that knowledge and start to gain some understanding of what the information I was studying was talking about. And so there can reach a point where my skill level or my experience, my being with skateboarding can reach the knowledge that I already had before from reading magazine or the books about it. And then I understand how to ride a skateboard. Because my being and my knowledge are at the same level. So that's what we're saying understanding is. Both the concepts, the ideas about things, as well as the experience. So this is why we talked about the personality in the previous few classes. Because maybe you already have experience, maybe you already have being with the personality, with certain things that happen. And now you can acquire through Gnosis the knowledge. And so now you can understand. That's the goal of Gnosis. We need to understand. Not just the knowledge, not just the being, but both of them together. So knowledge and being must not diverge too far. Otherwise, one will lack understanding. At the same time, the relation of knowledge to being does not change with a mere growth of knowledge. It changes only when being grows simultaneously with knowledge. In other words, understanding grows only with the growth of being and knowledge together. In ordinary thinking, people do not distinguish understanding from knowledge. They think that greater understanding depends only on greater knowledge. Therefore, they accumulate knowledge, or what they call knowledge, but they do not know how to accumulate understanding, and sometimes they don't even bother with it. And yet a person accustomed to self-observation knows for certain that at different periods in their life they have understood one and the same idea, one and the same thought, in a totally different way. It often seems strange to them that they could have understood so wrongly what they now, in their opinion, understand so rightly. And they realize at the same time that their knowledge has not changed, and that they knew as much about the given subject before as they now know. What then has changed? Their being has changed. And once their being has changed, then understanding must also change. The difference between knowledge and understanding becomes clear when we realize that knowledge may be the function of one center, like the intellectual center, or the emotional center, or the motor center. True understanding, however, is the function of the three brains. This is what we call comprehension. Thus, the thinking apparatus may know something, but comprehension appears only when a person feels and senses what is connected with it. We have spoken before about mechanicalness. A person cannot say that they comprehend the idea of mechanicity or mechanicalness if they only know about it with their mind. They must feel it with their whole mass, with their whole being. Then they will comprehend it. Right? We have to experience it. In the sphere of practical activity, people know very well the difference between mere knowledge and comprehension. They realize that to know and to know how to do are two different things, and that knowing how to do is not created by knowledge alone. But outside the sphere of practical activity, people do not clearly understand what understanding or comprehension means. As a rule, when people realize that they do not understand or comprehend something, they try to find a name for it. They try and find a name for what they don't understand. Once they give it a name or a label, then they think that that means that they understand it. But to find a name does not mean to comprehend. Unfortunately, people are usually satisfied with finding names. And a person who knows a great many names, that is, a great many words, is seen as understanding a great deal. Again, accepting, of course, any sphere of practical activity where their ignorance very soon becomes evident. So if we want to better change our level of being, if we want to become something different, then we need to want to be better, that longing to change. We must long for a real change. We must get out of this boring routine, out of this purely mechanical and wearied life, and we must create a permanent center of gravity or magnetic center in order to do this. Very interesting term. Remember, we talked about our magnet in part 4. This is related. Part 4 was about attitude and character. So now we can see that our attitude and our character is going to be related to our level of being. What we must first clearly comprehend is that each one of us is at one level of being or another. The level of being of the drunkard is different from that of someone who does not drink. And the level of being of the prostitute is different from that of the virgin. Let's imagine the numerous rungs of a ladder which extends itself upwards, vertically. Unquestionably, we find ourselves on any one of those rungs. On the rungs below us, we have people worse than us in terms of our being. And on the rungs above us, we have people better than us. On this extraordinary vertical, this marvelous ladder, it is clear that we can find all the various levels of being. Each person is different, and this is something that we cannot dispute. Undoubtedly, we're not talking about pretty or ugly, nor is this a question of age. The subject of time and of years, of being born, of maturing, developing, marrying, reproducing, and aging, belongs exclusively to the horizontal line versus the vertical line. On the marvelous ladder, on the vertical, the concept of time does not fit in. On the rungs of this ladder, we can only find levels of being, which are beyond time. In fact, they're only in the now. The mechanical hope of people serves no purpose. They think that with time things will get better. Our grandparents and great-grandparents thought the same way. However, facts have come to precisely demonstrate the opposite. What counts is our level of being. And this is the ladder, the vertical line. We're on a rung, but we can climb to another rung. The marvelous ladder, which we are talking about and which concerns the different levels of being, certainly has nothing to do with linear time. A higher level of being is directly above us from moment to moment. It is not in any remote horizontal future, but here and now within our own selves, on the vertical. That is, in each moment, we can choose our level of being. We can choose our attitude. And we can change our level of being. We can't do it in the future and we can't do it in the past, but we can do it in the moment. It is apparent, and anyone can understand, that the two lines, the horizontal and the vertical, intersect from moment to moment in our psychological interior and form a cross. The personality develops and unfolds on the horizontal line. The personality is born and dies with its linear time. It is mortal. A tomorrow does not exist for the personality of a dead person. Personality is not being. Levels of being are not of time, since being itself is not of time. It has nothing to do with the horizontal line. It is found within our own selves, right now, on the vertical. It would be absurd to look for our own being outside of ourselves. Therefore, it is not irrelevant to establish the following as a deduction. Titles, ranks, promotions, etc. in the external physical world cannot in any way originate authentic exaltation, a reevaluation of the being, or a move to a higher rung in the levels of being. What does this mean? If I have some degree in Freemasonry or another esoteric society, if I am a member of some esoteric group, a circle of esotericists or pseudo-esotericists, pseudo-occultists, and I am, they give me some title, that does not in any way mean that I have changed my level of being. Because the level of being is something internal. It is something that we do in the moment. So external ranks or titles do not in any way mean that we've changed our level of being. And remember, we need to change our level of being in order to have understanding. Because knowledge and being go together, which give us understanding, or what we call in Gnosis, comprehension. So don't think that we're going to have better comprehension because we got a belt or a certificate or somebody's calling us by a different title now. It requires interior work. A mathematical point exists within ourselves. Unquestionably, such a point is found neither in the past nor in the future. Whosoever wants to discover that mysterious point must look for it here and now within themselves, at this exact moment, not a second earlier, not a second later. The two horizontal and vertical lines of the Holy Cross intersect at this point, in the here and now. Thus we find ourselves, from moment to moment, before two paths. two things that we can concentrate on, either the horizontal or the vertical, either developing the personality, acquiring more money, or whatever, establishing things in the physical world, which we're not saying we should neglect it, but we could also choose to develop our level of being, not at the expense of what's going on in the physical world. Sometimes it may be, sometimes it may not be. But in the moment, we have the choice of what are we going to do. It is obvious that everyone travels the horizontal path. It is traveled by those who are juvenile and by those who are senile. It is evident that the vertical is different. It is the path of intelligent rebels, of revolutionaries. When one remembers oneself and one works upon oneself, when one does not become identified with all the problems and sorrows of life, it is a fact that one is traveling along the vertical path. Certainly, it is never easy to eliminate negative emotions, to lose all identification with our trend of life, with all types of problems, business, debts, loan payments, mortgages, telephone bills, water bills, electricity or power bills, etc. Unemployed people, those who have lost their job for one reason or another, evidently suffer because they lack money. And for them to forget about their situation and to not worry or identify themselves with it becomes tremendously difficult. Those who suffer and those who cry, those who have been victims of some betrayal or injustice, victims of ingratitude, defamation, or fraud, really forget themselves. They forget their inner being, and they totally identify themselves with their moral tragedy. But the fundamental characteristic of the vertical path is the work upon oneself. Nobody treads the path of the Great Rebellion if they never work upon themselves. The work to which we are referring is of a psychological nature. It deals with a certain transformation of the moment in which we find ourselves. We need to learn to live from moment to moment. For example, a person who is desperate about some sentimental, economic, or political problem has obviously forgotten about themselves. If such a person would stop for a moment, observe the situation, try to remember him or herself, and then try to understand the reason for their attitude. If they would reflect a little and think that everything passes away, that life is fleeting, illusory, and that death reduces all the vanities of the world to ashes. If they would understand that their problem in reality is nothing more than a match flame that will soon die out, then they would suddenly see, with great surprise, that everything has changed. It is possible to transform mechanical reactions through the logical confrontation and intimate self-reflection of the being. Whosoever learns how to transform mechanical reactions is, in fact, entering onto the vertical path. This represents a fundamental change in the level of being, an extraordinary result of the psychological rebellion, right? The esoteric work. It is necessary to study much and acquire knowledge, but it is also urgent to develop the spiritual being within ourselves. Scoundrels are the result of knowledge without the harmonious development of the spiritual being. On the other hand, the being well developed within us, but without intellectual knowledge of any kind, gives rise to stupid saints. A stupid saint possesses a very developed spiritual being, but since they do not have intellectual knowledge, they cannot do anything because they do not know how to do. Intellectual knowledge without spiritual being well developed produces intellectual confusion, perversity, pride, etc. During the Second World War, thousands of scientists, devoid of any spiritual element, committed terrible crimes with the purpose of carrying out scientific experiments in the name of science and humanity. Unfortunately, because of lack of love, people use the intellect in a destructive way. We need to acquire a powerful intellectual culture, but it must be very well balanced with true conscious spirituality. It is necessary for us to acquire the spiritual being, to develop the true being within ourselves, in order for us to be transformed into responsible individuals and not into scoundrels. It is necessary to acquire vocational skills with the purpose of being useful to our fellow human beings. It is necessary to study. We're not against the experiences of practical life or against the cultivation of the intellect, but what we condemn is lack of love. Knowledge and life experiences become destructive when there is lack of love. The ego usually traps intellectual knowledge and experiences when love is absent. The ego abuses experiences and the intellect when it uses them to grow stronger. We need a revolutionary ethic and a revolutionary psychology if we really want to dissolve the ego so that we can develop within ourselves a level of being which is genuinely spiritual. It is necessary to study professional and spiritual subjects in order to have a balanced mind. It is urgent to arrive at the intellectual synthesis and a spiritual synthesis if we really want a balanced mind. Wisdom without love is useless. Intellect without love only produces scoundrels. Wisdom and love should mutually balance each other. Wisdom without love is a destructive element. Love without wisdom can lead us to error. Love is law, but conscious love. Wisdom should only be administered by individuals filled with true love. We must comprehend the work we are carrying out upon ourselves. In Gnosis, above all, it is necessary to develop consciousness of what the Gnostic esoteric initiatic knowledge is, and of what understanding or comprehension is. Only by properly uniting being and knowledge with the flame of creative comprehension, only by properly uniting being and knowledge will the flame of creative comprehension arise within us. If we took a common person from the street and wanted to make out of them something better, then where should we start? If that person is full of anger, resentment, enviousness, etc., then what can we do to make that person better? Well, obviously a lot of patience would be necessary, and we would have to awaken in them the longing to be better. Then the Gnostic knowledge could be taught. Because if they don't have the longing to be better, then they're not going to care about this knowledge. This longing to be better is very important if we actually want to succeed on the path. Because without it, we do not seek to overcome any obstacles, and we just return to our habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. If we study these subjects just for the purpose of gaining knowledge, but without changing our level of being, then what's the point? Being and knowledge are different. Someone can know a lot. They may have a lot of knowledge. But this person could also have a very low sense of morality or ethics. What good is it to know a lot if we have not developed our being? If we have horrendous defects? It is good for nothing, right? Someone could have studied many books about the esoteric path and still be able to steal, slander, fornicate, to be an adulterer. They might know a lot about yoga and chakras. They might know a lot about Kabbalah. They might have read a lot of theosophy, etc. But what good is it? In Gnosis, a very special equilibrium is necessary. And that's why one comes to these kinds of studies. For this equilibrium, it is very important to have a magnetic center already formed. What we want is to reach the unity of life free in its movement, to integrate ourselves, to become sacred individuals. And this is only possible by working on ourselves, eliminating our own psychological mistakes. If we accomplish that, then we can become sacred individuals. The difference between two persons is in their level of being, in the different levels of being. The closer one is to sacred individuality, the more naturally exalted one is. The farther one is from one's sacred individuality, the lower level of being one has. So just as a note related to the previous class, if we don't change our level of being, or I should say, if we want to change our level of being, then we need to remove buffers, because buffers are the things that keep us in the same level of being. They keep us the same. They keep us justifying to ourselves staying the same. They don't allow us to feel those shocks, which allow us to realize we need to change. So that's part of the work of changing our level of being. All right, we'll stop there. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the comment area. So we'll open it up now for questions or comments. We also want to invite you to meditation tomorrow at the same time, as well as to our next week's class, Part 9. We'll do some more Gnostic psychology. So we want to invite you to join us same time next week so we can study that. We've got 2 more classes in this Introduction to Gnostic Psychology series. So I want to invite you guys to join us for that as well. All right, it doesn't look like there's any questions at this time, so we're going to end it there. We want to thank you for your attention, for being here. We hope that this has been beneficial, and we again want to invite you to meditation tomorrow so that we can continue these esoteric studies, so that we can progress internally, and so that we can have some being with meditation together. So we invite you to join us there, and or next week for class, or both. And in the meantime, we wish you the best in your esoteric work.